This video is brought to you by Santa Barbara County Resource Recovery and Waste Management Division. Hello and welcome to Composting with Ecology. We are a county-funded nonprofit whose goal it is to educate and empower students to be better environmental stewards and to improve the health of our planet and the environment. Today we'll be discussing the hidden world of decomposition and talking about what it takes to transform our leftover food scraps into healthy and nutrient-dense compost that we can give back to our gardens and to our plants. Let's look at a few different ways that we can make compost. During this lesson, we'll learn several different ways that you can make your own compost pile at home and hopefully have a better understanding of exactly what's going on in your compost pile. The style of composting that we generally teach in our classes here at Ecology is called Vermicompost and comes from the German word for worm. Let's take a look at one of our actual vermicompost piles and see what's there. So the worms we're looking at here are a species called red wriggler worms that are commonly used for fishing and composting. You'll see that they are slightly moist looking. This is because they actually need to stay a little wet as they breathe through their skin and not with lungs like you or I. They also are squirming and wiggling all different directions, which shows us that they're what we call invertebrates, meaning they lack vertebrae that make up a backbone or spine, so they can really move any direction that they want, but they don't get very much health from teeth like you or I do. And they actually sense with the more primitive eye that only allows them to see the difference between dark and light. This is a large vermicompost bin here at Adams Elementary School. Let's learn a little bit about our decomposer friends and the garden FBI by taking a look inside. Right. Over here, we have some of our sowbug or roly-poly friends. These decomposers work by shredding bits of decomposing food or plant and organic matter into smaller pieces that are more edible for other organisms like worms and bacteria. Our primary decomposers are going to be fungus and bacteria that will soften and start to break down the organic matter we see here. Mostly our food scraps that provide nitrogen and paper that provides carbon. Now, because worms don't have teeth, they rely on a gizzard, which is kind of a grinding organ similar to what chickens use, to help break down some of these products. When they are ready, they'll drop that as worm castings or worm poop, which is the final product of compost that we actually use. You can see this dark material is actually worm castings right here. And this really nutrient-dense material can be applied directly into our garden beds. It can be applied to our pots, potting soil, or directly to our plants. So if you notice, next to our worm bin, there's lots of cardboard and other types of paper here. And the reason that we have these left out is because when our compost pile has fresh greens and food scraps added to it, that's a lot of nitrogen. We need to add enough carbon to this as well, so that our ratio is about 70% carbon and about 30% nitrogen. That way we'll have a nice, healthy compost that's going to be able to heat up to about 160 degrees and decompose much faster. Here we have a different style of composting that doesn't actually involve us purchasing worms or adding worms into a bin. This is a more traditional kind of composting known as Thermophilic Composting. That means that we're using different combinations of carbon and nitrogen-rich materials in layers so that we can create a nice warm heat coming from that compost to show signs of decomposition. Now you can also use a similar bin like this for static composting. Static composting means that we're not actually going in and watering our compost or turning it, meaning scooping out with a shovel and then putting it back in after mixing. Static compost takes a lot longer. It doesn't get very warm during the process, but it still produces a very nutrient-rich compost. So as we can see, there's many different ways to compost. Some of them have their own benefits, such as time it takes to create or the amount of food you can put into it. But basically, they all are layering browns and greens meaning dry materials like dried leaves and grass clippings to provide carbon, or some fresh foods and food scraps and green materials like this fennel here to provide nitrogen. Now, after that, we just basically are adding enough soil to provide some microorganisms and fungus to get the decomposition process started, and enough water to keep that nice and moist. You can keep your compost piles freestanding or in an enclosure like this. And in a static compost, we just let this sit, adding water every once in a while and checking back on the decomposition. However, to have a thermophilic pile, we may actually want to be turning our compost, which means that we're going to take it out and move it around to get some oxygen into there and aerate it. By doing so, we boost the level and amount of microorganisms that are in our pile and speed up the process. And eventually, we'll have what looks more like this material. Possibly if we dig down in here, we'll be able to see this nice, beautiful, dense, dark compost is actually beginning to form much further deep down. I like to think about composting as almost like recycling our plants and organic matter. While we all know that we could throw these into our garbage cans and eventually the landfill, by composting our plants, we're saving and utilizing the nutritional value that they were grown with and adding it back to the planet. Now, most of us have probably heard the term climate change before. It's something that we're currently hearing about quite a bit. When we place our food scraps into the garbage bin, it's going to be moved to a landfill, and there our food scraps will not compost naturally. What happens is our food scraps are placed deep underground and they're actually sealed with a layer of soil. Their oxygen cannot permeate, and so the only type of bacteria to help us in the decomposition process is called anaerobic bacteria. Unfortunately, this bacteria is responsible for emissions such as methane gas, a very stinky, smelly gas that forms out of our organic matter and food scraps that actually has a larger impact on air pollution and climate change than even our cars' exhaust and other factory exhausts. That gas gets trapped by the greenhouse effect, which happens when gases from our planet rise up into the skies and atmosphere. When the sun's heat and energy bounce off of the ground we walk on, instead of leaving the planet, they become trapped under a blanket of gas above us that can increase the temperature of our world, much like our planet getting a fever or receiving changes to what we call normal weather. Let's take a walk around our yards and find out where the best place is for our own new home compost system. A few things to consider while we're doing this is our distance from our kitchen, which you can see here behind me, as well as a flat, unpaved surface, preferably in the shade and downwind from our home. As I find myself frequently leaving my kitchen to drop off my food scraps, I want this distance to be something that is not too far and that I can find myself or see myself walking to daily or every other day. For me, that might mean somewhere close by and in the shade. It's also important to remember that we need for our surface to be a natural material and not concrete, so that we get airflow into our compost bins and ensure that we don't have any rot or residue underneath. I like to keep mine out of sight and downwind, but when our compost piles are nice and healthy, we shouldn't actually have any smells emanating from it anyway. A flat and unpaved surface will ensure that our compost is receiving airflow from underneath and is not rotting in an unhealthy way against an airtight concrete surface. Finding a spot with shade will ensure that our compost does not dry out and that the microorganisms inside are comfortable and alive. This will help reduce how often we water our compost and also reduce any smells. Lastly, an area downwind from our home will ensure that we never catch any unwanted smells wafting through our yards or houses. However, a healthy compost bin shouldn't smell like much anyway. This location is just a short walk away from my kitchen, and I can actually hide it behind this trellising. Now that I have some natural shade occurring, we can find this wonderful location to start our composting bin. With these three things, you will be sequestering all of your food scraps into healthy, nutrient-rich compost and creating some grade A garden products in no time. Thank you so much for joining us today, and be sure to check out the links at the end of this film to find additional resources for help on your composting and gardening journey.